The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the sterile corridors of Millbrook General Hospital as Henry Hank Carter pushed his supply cart down the East Wing hallway. At 71 years old, his shoulders still carried the military bearing that 20 years of civilian work couldn't quite erase. The cart's squeaky wheel, the one he'd been meaning to fix for months, echoed off the walls like a metronome marking time. Hank had been making this same route for nearly 2 decades, delivering supplies to every department, knowing every face, every name, every story that walked these halls. The nurses called him Hank the Tank with affection, and the doctors respected his quiet efficiency. He wasn't just a porter, he was part of the hospital's heartbeat. But this Tuesday morning felt different. There was something in the air, a tension he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way Dr. Martinez had avoided eye contact when she passed him earlier, or how Susan, the head nurse, had given him that look, the one that said she knew something he didn't. The answer came when he rounded the corner near the administrative offices and found Director James Whitmore waiting for him, flanked by his assistant and a young man Hank didn't recognize. Whitmore was a thin, nervous type who always seemed to be checking his watch, as if he had somewhere more important to be than running a hospital. "Carter," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying that official tone that meant bad news. "I need to speak with you." Hank brought his cart to a stop, the squeaky wheel giving one last protest. Around them, the usual morning hustle continued, orderlies rushing past with gurneys, nurses checking charts, the constant undercurrent of beeping monitors and muffled conversations. But Hank noticed how the nearby staff had slowed their pace, pretending to be busy while obviously listening. "Sure thing, Mr. Whitmore. What can I do for you?" Whitmore cleared his throat and pulled out a clipboard, avoiding Hank's steady gaze. "There's been a reorganization in the transport department. Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned to assistant porter duties." The words hit Hank like a physical blow, but his face remained impassive. 20 years of service, and they were demoting him in the middle of a hospital corridor like he was some kind of problem employee. "I see. May I ask why?" "It's a cost-cutting measure," Whitmore said quickly, then gestured to the young man beside him. "This is my nephew Caleb Whitmore. He'll be taking over your position as senior porter. He has experience in logistics." Hank looked at Caleb, barely 25, wearing expensive sneakers and a smirk that suggested he thought this was all very amusing. The kid had soft hands, the kind that had never done a day of real work. But Hank had learned long ago when to fight and when to accept the things you couldn't change. "Understood," Hank said simply. "Should I report to someone about my new duties?" "Mrs. Patterson in HR will fill you out," Whitmore replied, relief evident in his voice that Hank wasn't making a scene. "Caleb, why don't you shadow Hank for the rest of the week to learn the ropes?" As Whitmore hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, Caleb stepped closer to Hank's cart. The young man's cologne was overpowering in the antiseptic hospital air. "So, old man," Caleb said, loud enough for the nearby staff to hear, "looks like you're working for me now. Hope you can keep up." Dr. Martinez, who had been walking by, stopped and turned. "Excuse me?" "Oh, nothing, Doc," Caleb said with fake innocence. "Just getting acquainted with my new assistant here." Dr. Martinez looked like she wanted to say something, but after a glance at Hank's calm expression, she continued down the hall, shaking her head. Hank had seen that look before, good people who wanted to help but couldn't or wouldn't risk their own positions. "Come on, Gramps," Caleb continued, enjoying the attention. "Show me where the coffee cart is. I figure that's about your speed now." Hank began pushing his cart forward, the squeak now sounding like fingernails on a chalkboard. Behind him, he could hear Caleb's designer sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, trying to keep up. The young man kept up a steady stream of commentary, complaints about having to be at work so early, jokes about the prehistoric equipment, and increasingly pointed remarks about Hank's age. "You know," Caleb said as they entered the storage room, "my uncle was telling me about some of the dead weight around here. Guess it's time to clean house. Know what I mean?" Hank methodically checked inventory, marking items on his clipboard. Each movement was precise, practiced. He'd reorganized this entire storage system 3 years ago, when the hospital had expanded, creating an efficiency model that other departments had copied. But none of that seemed to matter now. "Cat got your tongue, old-timer?" Caleb pressed. "Or are you one of those grumpy old guys who doesn't like change?" "Just learning my new place," Hank replied quietly, continuing his work. Something in Hank's tone made Caleb pause, as if he'd sensed depths he hadn't expected. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by that same entitled smirk. "Yeah, well, your new place is wherever I tell you it is." The words echoed in the storage room, and Hank's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his pen. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something cold and distant, like he was seeing not a spoiled young man, but a different kind of threat entirely. But then it was gone, replaced by that same patient acceptance. As they continued the rounds, staff members who had worked with Hank for years watched the exchange with obvious discomfort. Nurse Susan Peters, who had been at Millbrook almost as long as Hank, finally couldn't contain herself. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to her colleague as they passed. "Hank knows this place better than anyone. He saved my ass more times than I can count." "Shh," a colleague warned, glancing around nervously. "You know how Whitmore is about family." But Susan wasn't finished. She approached Hank directly, ignoring Caleb's presence. "Hank, I just want you to know that this is bullshit. Everyone knows it." "Language, ladies," Caleb interjected with a grin. "This is a professional environment." Susan turned on him, her 23 years of nursing experience evident in her no-nonsense expression. "Professional? You want to talk about professional? This man has been keeping this place running since before you were born." Hey. Caleb raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get upset. Change is hard, I get it. But Uncle James knows what's best for the hospital." "Uncle James," Susan repeated with disgust. "Right." As the confrontation escalated, Hank quietly stepped between them. "It's okay, Susan. Really. We all do what we have to do." There was something in his voice, a calmness that seemed to come from experience with much worse situations than workplace politics. Susan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly and walked away, but not before shooting Caleb a look that could have melted steel. "Wow," Caleb said, clearly enjoying himself. "Tough crowd. Good thing I'm here to modernize this place." The rest of the day continued in much the same fashion. Caleb treated Hank like a servant, making increasingly outrageous demands and comments. He ordered Hank to clean up messes he'd made himself, sent him on pointless errands, and made jokes about putting the old horse out to pasture. Each incident was witnessed by staff members who had respected Hank for years, creating a growing undercurrent of resentment. But what bothered people most wasn't Caleb's rudeness, it was Hank's response. The man who had been a steady, reliable presence for 2 decades just took it. He followed orders without complaint, cleaned up messes without comment, and accepted every humiliation with the same quiet dignity. As the day wound down, Hank was in the basement storage area, reorganizing supplies that Caleb had deliberately scattered. The young man had left early, claiming he had important family business to attend to. Hank worked methodically in the fluorescent lighting, his movements efficient despite his age. "Hank?" He turned to find Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of emergency medicine, standing in the doorway. She was one of the few people at Millbrook who had been there longer than Hank, and her expression was troubled. "Dr. Williams, what can I do for you?" She stepped into the storage room, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to apologize for what happened today. This whole situation, it's not right." "It's not your fault, Doc." "Maybe not, but I should have said something. We all should have." She paused, studying his face. "Hank, in all the years I've known you, you've never talked about what you did before you came here. But today, watching you handle that little shit, there's more to your story, isn't there?" Hank continued organizing supplies, not meeting her eyes. "We all have our stories, Doc." "That's not an answer." For a moment, The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. Then Hank straightened up, his back to her, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during his confrontations with Caleb. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy think they've already won. Dr. Williams felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his tone, something that spoke of experiences far beyond the sterile walls of Millbrook General. "Hank, what did you do before you came here?" But when she looked up, he was gone, having slipped out through the service entrance with the silent efficiency of someone who knew how to move without being noticed. That night, as Hank sat in his small apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, he stared at a photograph on his mantel. It showed a much younger version of himself in military fatigues, standing next to a helicopter with his arm around another soldier. Both men were covered in mud and blood, but they were smiling with the desperate relief of people who had just survived something terrible. The other soldier in the photo looked very young, maybe 19 or 20. He was thin and pale, with frightened eyes that seemed too old for his face. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, someone had written, "Tommy Poster, Firebase Charlie, June 1971. I owe you everything, Sarge." Hank held the photo for a long time, remembering. The monsoon rain was coming down in sheets, turning the jungle floor into a muddy hell. Sergeant Henry Carter crouched behind a fallen log, his medical bag clutched in one hand, his rifle in the other. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Charlie Company was pinned down, taking heavy casualties, and they needed immediate medical evac. "Negative on the dust-off," came the voice from command. "Too hot. Birds can't get in there." Hank looked at his squad, 6 men, all of them barely old enough to vote, all of them looking at him with the kind of trust that could get you killed if you weren't careful. But that was the job. Someone had to make the hard calls. "We're going in on foot," he decided. "Medical evac, priority 1. Private Tommy Poster, the newest member of their unit, looked terrified. The kid had only been in country for 2 weeks, and this was his first real combat situation. "Sarge, the LZ is crawling with Charlie. We'll never make it." "We'll make it," Hank said with the kind of certainty that comes from having no other choice. "Stay close, keep your head down, and do exactly what I tell you." The trek through the jungle was a nightmare of mud, blood, and constant gunfire. They moved from cover to cover, Hank leading the way with instincts honed by 18 months of combat. Behind him, Poster stumbled and fell repeatedly, his equipment rattling with each step. "Quiet," Hank hissed back at him. "Sound travels." When they finally reached Charlie Company's position, the situation was worse than the radio reports had indicated. 7 men were down, 3 critically wounded. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides, and ammunition was running low. "Jesus Christ, Sarge!" gasped Lieutenant Morrison, the unit's commanding officer. "Am I glad to see you? We got wounded who won't make it without immediate evac." Hank quickly assessed the casualties while his squad took defensive positions. The worst case was a kid named Jackson who had taken shrapnel to the chest. He was conscious, but fading fast, blood frothing at his lips. "We need to move, now," Hank told Morrison. "Can your men provide covering fire for a withdrawal?" "Negative. We're down to our last magazines. Soon as we show ourselves, they'll cut us to pieces." That's when Hank made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He pulled out a smoke grenade and a white phosphorus marker. "Poster," he called to the young private. "You still got that radio?" "Yes, Sarge." "Call in artillery on these coordinates." He rattled off a string of numbers. Poster's face went white. "Sarge, those coordinates, that's awful close to our position." "I know what I'm doing, son. Make the call." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of everyone's lives. The artillery barrage was so close that shrapnel rained down on their position, but it was effective. The enemy fire stopped, and in the confusion, Hank led the evacuation of the wounded. He carried Jackson personally, hauling the wounded soldier through mud and undergrowth, while enemy fire resumed sporadically around them. Poster stayed with him every step of the way, despite his terror, helping to clear a path and watching Hank's back. They made it to the extraction point just as the helicopters arrived. Jackson survived. So did the other wounded. And Private Tommy Poster learned what real leadership looked like. As they waited for their own transport, Poster sat next to Hank, both of them exhausted and filthy. "Sarge," he said quietly, "I thought we were all going to die back there." "We might have," Hank replied honestly, "but we didn't." "How did you know? About the artillery, I mean. How did you know we'd survive?" Hank was quiet for a long time, staring at the jungle that had nearly killed them all. "Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you just have to trust that if you do the right thing, for the right reasons, things will work out." Poster nodded, trying to understand. "Sarge, if we make it home, when we make it home, I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did here. If you ever need anything at all, I'll be there." "You don't owe me anything, kid. You did your job." "No, Sarge, you saved my life, all our lives. That means something." The memory faded as Hank set the photograph back on the mantel. That was a lifetime ago, in a place that felt like another world. Tommy Poster had kept his word, staying in touch for a few years after the war. Last Hank had heard, the kid had gone into government work, something about veteran affairs. But that was 20 years ago, and people lose touch. The next morning brought a new humiliation. Hank arrived at work to find Caleb already there, surrounded by several other young staff members who were laughing at something on his phone. "Oh, perfect timing, Gramps," Caleb called out. "I was just telling everyone about my new assistant." As Hank approached, he could see what was on the phone screen. A video that Caleb had apparently taken the day before, showing Hank cleaning up one of the messes Caleb had deliberately made. The video was edited to make it look like Hank was confused and incompetent, with mocking commentary added over the footage. 20,000 views already, Caleb announced proudly. Hashtag old-timer, hashtag workplace comedy. I'm thinking of making it a series. The laughter from the younger staff members felt like physical blows, but it was the expressions on the faces of the older employees that really hurt. They looked ashamed of their silence, ashamed of their inaction, ashamed of working in a place where this kind of behavior was tolerated. "That's enough," came a stern voice from behind them. Dr. Williams approached the group, her expression thunderous. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you have work to do." "Just having some fun, Doc," Caleb replied, but he pocketed his phone. "No harm, no foul." "There's plenty of harm," Dr. Williams shot back. "And if I see that video posted anywhere else, you'll be having a conversation with HR about workplace harassment." Caleb's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Hey, no problem. Uncle James said I should be making friends anyway." After the group dispersed, Dr. Williams turned to Hank. "This has gone too far. I'm filing a complaint." "Don't," Hank said quietly. "It'll just make things worse." "Worse? How could they possibly be worse?" But Hank had already moved on, pushing his cart toward the supply closet with that same infuriating calm. Dr. Williams watched him go, feeling helpless and angry in equal measure. The situation escalated over the next few days. Caleb seemed to view Hank's passive acceptance as a challenge, pushing harder and harder to get a reaction. He accidentally spilled coffee on Hank's clean uniforms. He sent him to the wrong departments with incorrect orders, causing confusion and delays. He made increasingly cruel jokes about Hank's age, his appearance, and his mental capacity. Through it all, Hank remained silent and professional. But those who knew him well began to notice subtle changes. He moved differently, more quietly, more deliberately. His eyes seemed to constantly scan his surroundings as if he were mapping escape routes or identifying potential threats. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, his expression would go completely blank, as if he were somewhere else entirely. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. Hank was in the pharmacy storage room conducting his weekly inventory of controlled substances, a responsibility he'd held for 15 years without a single discrepancy. The work required careful attention to detail, checking each bottle against the log sheets and noting any irregularities. He had just finished counting the morphine when Caleb appeared in the doorway. his usual smirk replaced by something more calculating. "Hey there, old man. Working hard, I see." "Just finishing the controlled substance inventory," Hank replied without looking up. "Oh, that's interesting. I was just talking to my uncle about security procedures. He's concerned about some irregularities in the pharmacy reports." Something in Caleb's tone made Hank look up. The younger man was no longer smiling, and there was a predatory gleam in his eyes. "What kind of irregularities?" "Missing medications. Opioids, specifically. The kind of stuff that has real street value, if you know what I mean." Hank set down his clipboard, giving Caleb his full attention for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that when someone has access to valuable drugs and they're facing financial pressure, maybe worried about losing their job, well, sometimes people make poor choices." The storage room was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units. Hank studied Caleb's face, seeing something there that hadn't been visible before. This wasn't just spoiled nephew throwing his weight around. This was something more deliberate, more dangerous. "Caleb," Hank said slowly, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to do." "Oh, I've thought about it plenty." Caleb pulled out his phone and showed Hank the screen. It displayed a photo of several empty medication bottles that should have contained morphine and OxyContin. "Funny thing about these bottles, they were found in your locker." Hank felt a chill run down his spine. "That's impossible." "I don't know what game you're playing, but..." "No game, Gramps. Just facts. The bottles were in your locker and they're missing from the inventory. Security cameras will show you were the last person to access these medications." Caleb's smirk returned. "Unless, of course, you want to make things easier on everyone and just resign. Quietly. Today." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the small storage room. Then something shifted in Hank's expression, not anger, not fear, but a kind of cold calculation that made Caleb take an involuntary step backward. "You planted those bottles," Hank said quietly. "Prove it. You're stealing drugs from cancer patients. From dying children." "Hey, I'm not stealing anything. You are. At least that's what the evidence shows." Hank stood slowly and suddenly the storage room felt much smaller. "Son, you have no idea what you're messing with."
Something in his voice, a quality that hadn't been there during any of their previous encounters, made Caleb's confidence waver. For just a moment, he seemed to see past the elderly porter to something else underneath. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and his smirk returned. "Actually, I think I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A washed-up old man who's about to become a very public example of what happens when you don't know your place." 20 minutes later, the entire day shift was gathered in the main conference room for an emergency meeting. Director Whitmore stood at the front of the room, looking more nervous than usual, while Caleb sat in the front row with an expression of barely contained excitement. "I'm sorry to call you all together on such short notice," Whitmore began, "but we have a serious security issue that needs to be addressed immediately." The room was filled with murmurs and worried glances.
These kinds of all-hands meetings were rare and never meant good news. "This morning we discovered that several controlled substances are missing from our pharmacy inventory. Morphine, OxyContin, and other Schedule II medications with significant street value." The murmurs grew louder. Drug theft was every hospital's nightmare, not just because of the legal and regulatory consequences, but because it meant someone was stealing medications from patients who desperately needed them. "After a preliminary investigation," Whitmore continued, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, "we found evidence suggesting that the theft was committed by someone with regular access to the pharmacy storage areas." All eyes turned to Hank, who sat in the back row, his expression unreadable. Around him, colleagues who had worked with him for years looked stunned and confused. "The stolen medications were found in employee locker 247, which is assigned to Henry Carter." A collective gasp went up from the room. Dr. Williams stood up immediately. "That's impossible. James, you know Hank, this is ridiculous." "The evidence speaks for itself," Whitmore replied, though he still wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Until this matter is fully investigated, Mr. Carter is suspended without pay effective immediately.
This is a setup,
Nurse Susan called out.
Anyone with eyes can see what's been happening here this week.
That's enough, Whitmore snapped. This is a serious criminal matter, not a popularity contest. Mr. Carter, please surrender your badge and keys to security. You'll be escorted from the building. The room erupted in angry voices as people began shouting questions and accusations. In the chaos, almost no one noticed Hank himself. He sat quietly in his chair, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. When the security guard approached him, he stood without protest and handed over his badge and keys. As he was escorted toward the door, Dr. Williams called out to him, "Hank, we know this isn't true. We'll figure this out." He turned to look at her, and for just a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her think of deep water and dangerous currents. "Don't worry about me, Doc," he said quietly. "The truth has a way of coming out." Then he was gone, walking down the corridor he'd traveled for 20 years, this time for what everyone assumed would be the last time. Caleb watched from the conference room window as Hank disappeared into the parking lot, his triumph complete. Around him, the hospital staff were still arguing about the injustice of it all, but he wasn't listening. He was already thinking about his next move, his next target. Maybe that stuck-up Dr. Williams who thought she was so smart. Or Nurse Susan with her self-righteous attitude. What Caleb didn't know was that Hank wasn't going home. Instead, he drove to a small diner 3 miles from the hospital, where he ordered coffee and a piece of pie he didn't want, and made a phone call to a number he hadn't dialed in 15 years. "Veterans Affairs Administration Regional Director's Office, this is Sandra." "Sandra, this is Henry Carter. I need to speak with Director Foster. Tell him it's Sergeant Carter from Firebase Charlie." There was a pause. "I'm sorry, sir, but Director Foster is in meetings all day. If you'd like to leave a message..." "Tell him it's about Tommy Poster and a promise he made in 1971. Another pause, longer this time. "Please hold." Less than 30 seconds later, a familiar voice came on the line. Older now, but still recognizable. "Jesus Christ, Hank? Is that really you?" "Hello, Tommy." "My God, it's been what, 15 years? 20? How did you even get this number?" "I need to ask you a favor, Tommy." The line went quiet. Then, "Whatever you need, Sarge. You know that." That evening, as Hank sat in his apartment looking at old photographs, the drama at Millbrook General was far from over. Caleb had convinced his uncle to call a press conference for the next morning, ostensibly to assure the public that the hospital took drug theft seriously and that the perpetrator had been caught quickly. But really, Caleb wanted to enjoy his victory publicly. He wanted the whole town to see what happened to people who didn't respect his authority. What he didn't know was that at 11:43 p.m., while he was sleeping peacefully in his expensive apartment, an electrical fire started in the basement of Millbrook General Hospital. The fire began in the old wiring that fed the pharmacy storage area, the same area where Caleb had planted the evidence against Hank just 2 days earlier. It was probably a coincidence, the investigators would later conclude. Old buildings, old wiring, these things happened. But coincidence or not, the fire spread quickly through the basement levels, filling the building with smoke and triggering every alarm in the hospital. The automatic fire suppression system activated, but it wasn't enough. The main elevator shaft acted like a chimney, drawing smoke up through the building, and within minutes, the hospital was in chaos. Dr. Williams was on duty in the ER when the alarms went off. Her first thought was that it was another drill. The hospital ran fire drills monthly, and staff were well trained in evacuation procedures. But when she smelled smoke and heard the genuine panic in the security guard's voice over the intercom, she realized this was no drill. "All departments, this is not a drill. We have a confirmed fire in the basement level. Begin immediate evacuation of all patients and personnel. All departments, begin immediate evacuation." The next few minutes were controlled chaos. Nurses and orderlies rushed to move patients, some of whom were too sick to be moved quickly. The elevators had automatically shut down as a safety precaution, which meant everyone had to use the stairs. For patients on ventilators or in critical condition, this presented a nightmare scenario. Dr. Williams was helping to evacuate the ICU when she realized they had a problem. The main stairwell was filling with smoke faster than expected, and several of the emergency exits were blocked by construction work that had been ongoing for weeks. The contractors had assured everyone that the work wouldn't interfere with emergency procedures, but they hadn't counted on a real emergency. "The east stairwell is blocked," called out Nurse Susan, coughing from the smoke. "Construction equipment is blocking the door." "What about the west exit?" "Smoke's too thick. We can't get the gurneys through." Dr. Williams felt panic beginning to set in. They had 12 patients in critical condition, some of whom couldn't survive being moved quickly, and they were running out of safe evacuation routes. That's when she heard a voice she didn't expect. "Dr. Williams?" She turned to see Hank Carter walking up the stairs, moving against the flow of evacuees. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his hospital uniform, and he carried a large flashlight and what looked like a set of bolt cutters. "Hank? What are you doing here?" "I live 3 blocks away, saw the smoke." He looked around, taking in the situation with the kind of rapid assessment that spoke of experience with emergencies. "How many critical patients?" 12, but Hank, you shouldn't be here. You're not supposed to— "Doc," he interrupted, and his voice carried an authority she'd never heard from him before. "How many critical patients?" Something in his tone made her answer without thinking. 12, 3 on ventilators, 4 post-surgical, 5 cardiac monitoring. Elevators? Automatic shutdown. Main exits? East is blocked by construction, west is filling with smoke, south is— She paused, realizing she didn't know about the south exit. "The south emergency exit leads to the old loading dock," Hank said. "It's been chained shut for 2 years because of liability issues, but it's the clearest route to the parking lot." Dr. Williams stared at him. "How do you know that?" Instead of answering, Hank held up the bolt cutters. "I can get those chains off in 30 seconds. The loading dock has a ramp that can handle gurneys, and it exits directly to the parking lot where the ambulances are staging. But that exit hasn't been used in years. The fire department doesn't even know about it." "They will in about 2 minutes," Hank replied, already moving toward the south corridor. "Get your people ready to move." As Dr. Williams watched in amazement, Hank disappeared into the smoke-filled corridors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. 5 minutes later, he was back. "South exit is clear. Ramp is in good condition. I've already notified the fire incident commander. They're repositioning ambulances to that location." "How did you—" "Doc, we need to move now. The fire's spreading faster than the suppression system can handle." What followed was the most efficient patient evacuation Dr. Williams had ever seen. Hank seemed to be everywhere at once, guiding gurneys through corridors, coordinating with nurses, making quick decisions about which patients could be moved first and which needed special handling. He moved with a precision and authority that made everyone around him fall naturally into following his lead. But it wasn't just his efficiency that amazed the staff. It was his knowledge. Hank knew every corridor, every shortcut, every potential hazard in the building. He knew which stairs could handle the weight of medical equipment and which couldn't. He knew where the hospital kept emergency supplies that most staff had forgotten existed. He navigated the smoke-filled building like he had it memorized down to the last detail. "Careful with that corner," he called out to 2 orderlies struggling with a gurney. "Wheel gets caught on the threshold. Lift from the left side." "How does he know all this?" one of them muttered to the other. The answer came from Nurse Susan, who was watching Hank coordinate the evacuation with something approaching awe. 20 years, she said quietly. He's been walking these halls for 20 years, paying attention to everything. But it was more than just familiarity with the building. There was something almost military in the way Hank organized the evacuation, assigning specific tasks to specific people, establishing clear chains of command, maintaining constant communication with all teams. It was like watching someone slip into a role they'd been trained for their entire life. "Dr. Williams," Hank called out, "I need you to coordinate with the ER team outside. Make sure they're ready for incoming criticals." "What about you?" "I'm going back for the last group." "Hank, no. The fire department says the smoke is getting too thick on the upper floors." He looked at her with those same calm eyes that had accepted every humiliation Caleb had thrown at him. "Doc, there are still people up there." Before she could argue, he was gone, disappearing into the stairwell with that same silent efficiency that had marked everything he'd done that night. The last group included Mrs. Patterson from HR, 2 night shift technicians, and Caleb Whitmore, who had arrived at the hospital after hearing about the fire on the radio. Unlike everyone else, who had followed evacuation procedures and trusted the hospital staff to guide them to safety, Caleb had panicked and gotten himself lost in the maze of corridors on the 4th floor. Hank found him huddled in a supply closet, coughing and disoriented from smoke inhalation. "Please," Caleb gasped when he saw the flashlight beam. "I can't find the stairs! I can't breathe!" He didn't recognize Hank at first. The smoke and darkness, combined with his panic, made it hard to focus. It wasn't until they were halfway to the exit that he realized who was helping him. "Wait!" he coughed. You're not supposed to be here." Hank didn't reply, just kept guiding him through the corridors. "I mean, you're suspended. You're not supposed to be in the building." Still no response. They reached the stairwell, and Hank began helping Caleb down the stairs. "Why are you helping me?" Caleb asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Hank paused on the landing between the 3rd and 2nd floors. The smoke was thinner here, and for the first time that night he looked directly at Caleb. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. They continued down in silence until they reached the exit. As they emerged into the parking lot, Caleb was immediately surrounded by paramedics who began treating him for smoke inhalation. Through the chaos of EMTs and fire trucks, he watched Hank report to the fire chief, giving a detailed briefing on the building's condition and the status of the evacuation. It was only then that Caleb realized what he'd witnessed. The man he'd spent a week humiliating, the man he'd framed for drug theft, had just orchestrated the evacuation of an entire hospital. More than that, he'd personally risked his life to save Caleb himself. "Who is that guy?" one of the paramedics asked, watching Hank coordinate with the fire department. "That's Henry Carter," Dr. Williams replied, joining the group around Caleb's stretcher. "He used to work here." "Used to?" "He was suspended yesterday," she said, her voice carrying a weight of shame and regret. "For something he didn't do." The paramedic looked confused. "If he was suspended, what's he doing here?" "Saving lives," Dr. Williams replied, "like he's been doing for 20 years. As the night wore on and the fire was brought under control, the full scope of what had happened became clear. The evacuation had been flawless, not a single life lost, not a single serious injury. The fire department's incident commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Murphy, couldn't stop praising the hospital's response. "In 30 years of fighting fires," he told the assembled news crews, "I've never seen a civilian evacuation handled so professionally. Whoever coordinated that operation knew what they were doing."
But when reporters asked who had been in charge of the evacuation, they got conflicting answers. Some staff members pointed to Dr. Williams or the hospital administrators. Others mentioned Nurse Susan or the security chief. But a few people, when pressed, mentioned a former employee named Henry Carter. "Carter?" asked one persistent reporter. "Can we speak with him?" "He left," Dr. Williams replied, "right after the last person was evacuated." This was true. Hank had simply disappeared into the crowd of emergency responders and concerned citizens who had gathered in the parking lot. By the time anyone thought to look for him, he was gone. The next morning, as Millbrook General dealt with the aftermath of the fire, Director Whitmore found himself facing a crisis that went far beyond smoke damage and insurance claims.
The press conference he'd planned to announce Hank's arrest for drug theft now seemed grotesquely inappropriate. How do you publicly humiliate a man who had just saved an entire hospital? More immediately, Whitmore was facing a rebellion from his own staff. Dr. Williams had requested an emergency meeting with the hospital board. Nurse Susan was threatening to file a formal complaint with the state nursing board, and several department heads had made it clear that they would not continue working in an environment where good people were scapegoated to cover for administrative incompetence. "This has gone too far, James," Dr. Williams told Whitmore in his office that morning. "Everyone knows Caleb planted those drugs. Everyone knows this whole thing was a setup." "You can't prove that," Whitmore replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not legally, but I don't have to prove it legally. I just have to convince the medical board that this hospital is being run by people who value family connections over patient safety." Whitmore felt the walls closing in around him. The board of directors was already asking hard questions about the fire and the evacuation. If they started looking into Hank's suspension, if they realized that the man who had saved the hospital had been fired just days earlier. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Reinstate Hank immediately, full apology, full back pay, and get your nephew out of here before he does any more damage. I can't just—" "Yes, you can, and you will, because if you don't, I'll make sure every medical professional in this state knows exactly what kind of operation you're running here." As Whitmore struggled with his decision, Caleb was dealing with his own crisis. The events of the previous night had shaken him in ways he didn't quite understand. The man he'd spent a week tormenting had risked his life to save him, had carried him out of a burning building without hesitation, without a single word of reproach. For the first time in his privileged life, Caleb was forced to confront the reality of his own actions. He thought about the video he'd posted online, mocking Hank as he cleaned up messes. He thought about the drugs he'd planted in Hank's locker. He thought about the cruel jokes and the deliberate humiliations. And then he thought about strong hands guiding him through smoke-filled corridors, about a calm voice telling him everything would be okay, about someone risking their life for a person who didn't deserve it. The call came at 3:17 p.m. on Monday afternoon. Hank was in his kitchen, making a sandwich he didn't really want, when his phone rang. "Mr. Carter, this is Sandra from Director Foster's office. Director Foster would like to know if you could come to Washington this week for a meeting." "What kind of meeting?" "He said to tell you it's about a job opportunity. Something about hospital security consulting." Hank was quiet for a moment. "Tommy wants to offer me a job?" "Director Foster was very specific about the urgency, sir. He said to tell you that there's been a development in your situation, and he thinks you should be here when it happens." 2 hours later, Hank's phone rang again. This time, it was Director Whitmore. "Hank, I need to see you in my office tomorrow morning. There's been a development in the investigation." "What kind of development?" "New evidence has come to light. Evidence that changes things." Hank wasn't surprised. He'd expected this call since the moment he'd carried Caleb out of the burning hospital. Some people could live with that kind of debt. Others couldn't. "I'll be there," he said. The next morning, Hank walked through the front doors of Millbrook General for the first time since his suspension. The lobby was filled with construction workers and insurance adjusters dealing with the fire damage, but several staff members spotted him immediately. "Hank!" Nurse Susan called out, rushing over to hug him. "I'm so glad you're here. This whole thing is finally going to be sorted out." "Thanks, Susan." Dr. Williams appeared a moment later, looking relieved. "The whole staff has been waiting for this. We were ready to walk out if Whitmore didn't do the right thing." As Hank made his way to the administrative offices, he was stopped again and again by colleagues who wanted to thank him for the evacuation, to apologize for their silence during his persecution, to express their outrage at how he'd been treated. But it was the conversation with Caleb that surprised him most. He found the young man waiting outside Whitmore's office, looking nervous and ashamed. When he saw Hank approaching, Caleb stood up quickly. "Mr. Carter, I need to talk to you." Hank studied his face. The smirk was gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "Go ahead." "I wanted to apologize. For everything. The video. The things I said. Caleb's voice trailed off. "The drugs. I planted them in your locker. I know you know that, but I wanted to say it out loud. Why? Why did I do it? Because I'm a spoiled asshole who thought it would be funny to mess with someone who couldn't fight back. Caleb looked down at his hands. Why am I apologizing now? Because you saved my life. And because you're a better man than I'll ever be. Hank was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do now? I resigned this morning. I'm also going to make a full confession to the police about the drug thing. I know it probably won't make up for what I did, but it's a start. That's a good start, Hank agreed. Can I ask you something? Sure. That night, in the building, when you found me, why didn't you just leave me there? I mean, after everything I'd done to you, it would have been, I don't know, justice? Hank considered the question seriously. Son, there's a difference between justice and revenge. Justice is about making things right. Revenge is about making things even. And the thing about revenge is, it never really makes you even. It just makes you smaller. Before Caleb could respond, the door to Whitmore's office opened. Hank, please come in. The meeting was brief and awkward. Whitmore offered a formal apology, full reinstatement with back pay, and a promotion to Director of Hospital Security. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the hospital's insurance company was very interested in hiring Hank as a consultant on emergency preparedness. There's also this, Whitmore said, handing Hank an official-looking document. It came by courier this morning. The letterhead read, Department of Veterans Affairs, and was signed by Regional Director Thomas Foster. It was an offer for a position as Senior Consultant for Hospital Emergency Preparedness, with a salary that was considerably more than Hank had ever made in his life. Tommy Foster, Hank murmured, reading the letter. You know him? Whitmore asked. We served together a long time ago. What Whitmore didn't know was that Tommy Foster was also planning to be at Millbrook General that afternoon for a surprise visit. As Regional Director for Veterans Affairs, he had considerable influence over federal funding for hospitals that served veteran populations, and Millbrook General, he had learned, served a lot of veterans. Foster arrived at 2 p.m. in a government sedan, accompanied by 2 assistants and a briefcase full of documents. He was older now, grayer, carrying the weight of bureaucratic responsibility. But when he saw Hank in the lobby, the years seemed to fall away. Sarge, he said simply. Hello, Tommy. They shook hands, and for a moment both men were back in that jungle clearing 43 years ago, covered in mud and grateful to be alive. I read about what happened here, Foster said. The fire, the evacuation. Sounds like old times. Not quite that dramatic. Maybe not, but it got me thinking about something. About how we treat the people who've served. About what happens when we forget who they really are. Foster turned to address the small crowd that had gathered in the lobby, staff members, administrators, a few reporters who had somehow gotten word of his visit. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about the man standing next to me. His name is Henry Carter, and 43 years ago he saved my life, and the lives of 6 other soldiers in a place called Firebase Charlie. A murmur went through the crowd. Several people pulled out phones to record what was clearly going to be an important moment. Sergeant Carter led a medical evacuation under fire that day. He carried wounded men through enemy territory, called in artillery danger close to his own position, and made sure every single person made it home alive. Foster's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 3 Bronze Stars for his service in Vietnam. The lobby was completely silent now. Even the construction workers had stopped what they were doing to listen. But here's what I want you to understand, Foster continued. The medals don't tell the whole story. Henry Carter didn't just save lives in the jungle. He's been saving lives every day for the past 20 years, right here in this hospital. Maybe not as dramatically, maybe not in ways that make the evening news, but just as surely. He turned to look at Hank, who was clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "The man who coordinated your evacuation last week, who made sure every patient got out safely, who risked his own life to save others. That's the same man who's been walking these halls for 2 decades, making sure everything runs smoothly, making sure people are taken care of. That's who Henry Carter is. That's who he's always been." Foster reached into his briefcase and pulled out a framed certificate. "By the authority of the President of the United States and the Department of Veterans Affairs, it is my honor to present Henry Carter with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs Award for Exceptional Service, in recognition of his continued dedication to saving lives and serving others." The applause was thunderous. Dr. Williams was crying. Nurse Susan was cheering. Even some of the reporters were clapping. But Hank barely heard it. He was thinking about a scared 19-year-old kid named Tommy Poster, and about promises made in impossible places, and about how sometimes the best thing you can do is just keep doing the right thing, even when nobody notices. "Thank you, Tommy," he said quietly. "Thank you, Sarge. For everything." As the crowd began to disperse and the formal ceremonies wound down, Hank found himself standing in the corridor where this whole ordeal had begun just 2 weeks earlier. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same squeaky cart, his cart, sat nearby, waiting for him to resume his rounds. But everything was different now. Not because of the recognition or the medals or the job offers, because people saw him differently. More importantly, because he saw himself differently. For 20 years, he'd been just Hank the porter, content to blend into the background, to do his job quietly and go home. But the events of the past 2 weeks had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, someone has to step forward and take charge. Someone has to make the hard decisions and accept the responsibility. Someone has to be the person others can count on. As he pushed his cart down the familiar corridor, heading back to work for the first time in a week, Hank Carter smiled. The squeaky wheel still needed fixing, but that could wait. Right now he had rounds to make, people to check on, and a hospital to keep running. After all, that's what he did. That's who he was, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.